today is a day of national mourning in Russia. That's right, Russia, a nation moved by Saturday's death of the Polish president and a plane load of dignitaries in a crash on the approach to Smolensk days after the Russian prime minister went to nearby Katyn to acknowledge the 1940 massacre of 22,000 Polish officers. Vladimir Putin was back, this time again in the company of his Polish counterpart, and this time the two of them shared a hug, a spontaneous show of solidarity, and a startling break with the past. So there you see the two of them, and it's an interesting gesture because it really does look spontaneous. And the question from that arises is, what has made that hug possible, and what does this plane disaster mean for the future of relations between Moscow and Warsaw? More broadly, how will Poland position itself in the world in the wake of current circumstances? Today in the France 24 debate, Russia and Poland beyond tragedy, with Marek Brzezinski, Paris correspondent formerly for Radio France International's Polish service, which sadly, the first of RFI's Polish language services, and just gone off air for the last time.
For 21 years.
21 years you worked there. Yeah. But it had been going since the 1930s.
From the 1930s in Polish language, and now it disappeared from French media landscape.
All right. Also with us,
a shame.
And an important player in this discussion, because we're going to be looking at the context of what's going on right now in Poland with historian George Frederick Jewsbury of the Center for Russian World Caucasus and Central European Studies. Is that
something like that?
Something like that. Okay. And also with us, let's welcome him back from Brussels, Thomas Klau, senior analyst at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Poland's relationship with Europe, of course, a key element in this discussion. Welcome, Thomas. And from Warsaw, Jakub Kumak of the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Kumak, we can't stress enough that it wasn't just the President and the First Lady who lost their lives, but a host of top officials, including, we know, the Deputy Foreign Minister Andrzej Kremer, who's a member of your institute, and please accept our heartfelt condolences at this time. Let me begin with you. It's the first working day since the tragedy. Can you sum up the mood where you are?
Well, yes. Well, there is a feeling of mutual comprehension between Poles and Russians, probably the biggest one in the recent history. So, well, everybody, if you ask anybody here on the street, they will tell you the same. We were moved and really touched by the behaviors of the Russian authorities, and it will definitely influence the relations between Poland and Russia. So.
All right. Killed also in that plane crash was Anna Valentovich. Thank you. She was an unassuming employee of the Gdansk shipyard whose 1980 dismissal would spark the Solidarity movement led by Lech Wałęsa. Let's listen to the man who would go on to become Polish president.
We lost the elite of this country, a part of it. It's very similar to the Katyn massacre. At that time, our head was taken away and cut off. Now, unexpectedly, we have also lost great people from various political areas, and it will be very hard to replace them.
Is this a second Katyn?
Right, it looks like. I mean, I don't want to get here into metaphysics. But the fact that if the crash happens in Brussels, in any other places, it wouldn't be that symbolic in a meaning. Because so far, if you remember what happened after the Second World War, that the word Katyn was erased from the books, textbooks, historic books in France, in Great Britain. The Katyn didn't exist. The Katyn didn't exist in a European mentality, in European mind. And the fact that it happened in the Katyn, in order to celebrate 17th anniversary of a massacre, is very symbolic. Tells everything.
All right, let me ask you about that, George Frederick Jewsbury. Days before this massacre, there was a first ceremony, as we were saying at the outset. And at that one, the Russian Prime Minister stops short of apologizing. Nonetheless, Vladimir Putin calls it a tragedy and goes there on site and stands next to Donald Tusk, his Polish counterpart.
It's interesting. Putin has been, it's not quite a charm offensive, but last September the 1st, he was at Danzig, Gdansk, for the ceremonies commemorating the opening of the 70th anniversary of the opening of the war. And he came close to admitting that things weren't as they should be, as he did here. But what I want to emphasize, there's a continuity of Putin and Medvedev opening up to Eastern Europe. Medvedev was in Slovakia last week, for example. So the fact that these events have happened is not a unique thing. I think what is really interesting is the human response we see from Vladimir Putin, which we haven't seen.
I was going to say, that hug, what's your reaction to it?
Totally unexpected. I think totally spontaneous, not calculated. The only person who thought he had hugged him before was George Bush, who looked deep in his eyes and thought he saw a man of peace. No, I find this to be moving. I think Medvedev's response has been moving. He visited the Polish embassy, laid flowers. If this is atmospherics, it's good atmospherics.
All right, and Thomas Klau, I want to get to you on this one as well. Again, the context of this opening between of what George Frederick Dewsbury was describing, the Russians courting some of their former Warsaw Pact neighbors. How do you explain it in the current day?
Well, we've seen, as has already been said, an attempt by Vladimir Putin to improve relations with Poland even before this tragedy, and it is of course highly ironic that this extremely symbolic and for Poland devastating plane crash might now act as a further catalyst, if you like, if that is not too terrible a word, a further moment that helps towards that Polish-Russian rapprochement, which is very significant, not only for Polish-Russian relations, but also for the relationship of the whole European Union with its Russian neighbor.
All right, the whole of the European Union with its Russian neighbor. Why is that?
Well, there is a plurality of views within the EU on how to deal with Moscow, and traditionally, and certainly when both Kaczynski brothers were controlling the country's politics, Poland was firmly in the camp of those countries who took a rather hostile, or at least a very guarded approach towards Moscow, who stressed the differences over the possible areas for compromise, whereas countries like France, Germany, Italy were leading the camp of those who favoured constructive engagement over a more critical, more defensive attitude, a sort of post-Cold War policy, if you like. Now, Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, of course, had already initiated a change in Poland's attitude towards Moscow, a change that the late president, wasn't always happy with. But this new era, which seems to open in Polish-Russian relations, will increase very significantly the number of countries within the EU who are looking for constructive engagement with Russia. Dmitry Medvedev's visit in Paris to Nicolas Sarkozy a few weeks ago was an important element in that, possibly. And so maybe this will facilitate the EU developing really a coherent and more united approach towards Russia, where the countries who still see in Moscow the Cold War foe, in a sense,